The dust kicked up around Captain Margaret Maggie Thornton's boots as she walked across the grounds of Camp Meridian, a military base nestled in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky. It was June 1945, and the war in the Pacific had finally turned in America's favor. The prisoner of war facility had recently been expanded to house Japanese soldiers who had surrendered or been captured in the Pacific Theater. Margaret had just been transferred here from her previous posting in Texas, and she was determined to make a difference. She was lean, capable, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had worked twice as hard as everyone else to earn her place. At 34 years old, Margaret was one of the first women to achieve the rank of captain in the Military Support Corps, a distinction that had earned her both respect and resentment in equal measure. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight military bun beneath her cap, and her gray eyes had the kind of clarity that came from years of difficult decisions and sleepless nights. The war had changed Margaret in ways she couldn't fully explain to people back home. She had enlisted after her husband died in a factory accident, a senseless tragedy that had left her feeling hollow and purposeless. The military had given her structure, purpose, and a family of sorts. But it had also exposed her to the ugliness of human nature, the casual cruelty that people inflicted on one another when given the excuse of uniform and authority. As she approached the main administrative building, she heard the laughter before she saw them. A group of soldiers was gathered near the barracks, pointing and making jokes. Margaret's jaw tightened. She recognized the commanding officer, Colonel James Hartfield, a man she had already come to dislike intensely during her week at the camp. He was old-school military, the kind of man who believed that the rules didn't apply to him and that compassion was a weakness. "Well, if it isn't our lady captain," Colonel Hartfield called out, his voice dripping with mockery. He was a large man with a florid face and the confidence of someone who had never been questioned in his life. "Come to inspect the prisoners, make sure they're not too comfortable." Margaret stopped and turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm here to review the meal planning protocols, sir. I received reports that there have been some inconsistencies in the ration distribution." "Meal planning?" Colonel Hartfield laughed, a harsh, braying sound that made several of the other officers chuckle along with him. "Captain Thornton, these men tried to kill our boys. They bombed Pearl Harbor. Do you really think we should be worried about whether they get 3 meals a day or 2? Margaret had heard this argument before. She had heard it many times, and each time it made her want to scream. But she didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming got you nowhere. Instead, she spoke quietly, her words precise and measured. "Sir, with respect, we have a responsibility as a military power to treat prisoners humanely. The Geneva Convention." "The Geneva Convention," Colonel Hartfield interrupted, his face flushing red. "Captain, that's a nice sentiment, but this isn't some theoretical classroom. This is the real world. These men are our enemies. They deserve whatever we give them." The other officers snickered, and Margaret felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest. But she swallowed it down, the way she had learned to do. She took a breath and looked Colonel Hartfield directly in the eye. "I understand your perspective, sir, but I respectfully disagree, and I have direct authorization from General Morrison to oversee prisoner welfare protocols at this facility. So if you'll excuse me, I need to conduct my inspection." She turned and walked away, refusing to let him see her shake. Behind her, she could hear him muttering to the other officers, making jokes about women trying to run the military and that uptight widow playing soldier. The words stung, even though she had expected them, even though she had told herself she was prepared for them. The truth was, Margaret had never been prepared for how much people would underestimate her simply because of her gender. She had been the most qualified candidate for this position. She had the experience, the training, the record, but none of that seemed to matter to men like Colonel Hartfield. To them, she would always be a woman playing dress-up in a man's uniform. She made her way to the dining facility, where Sergeant Tom Martinez was overseeing the evening meal preparation. Tom was one of the few officers Margaret had found to be genuinely respectful and professional. He was in his early 40s, a veteran of the European theater who had lost his left arm below the elbow at the Battle of the Bulge. Despite his injury, he had insisted on continuing to serve, and he had been assigned to Camp Meridian as a logistics coordinator. "Captain Thornton," Tom greeted her with a respectful nod. "I was wondering when you'd make it over here. I heard Colonel Hartfield giving you trouble." "Nothing I can't handle," Margaret said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "Tom, I need to see the prisoner meal logs for the past 2 weeks." Tom led her to a small office off the main kitchen. The records showed exactly what Margaret had suspected. The prisoners were receiving significantly less food than the prescribed rations, and the quality of what they did receive was far below the established standards. There were gaps in the documentation, missing entries, and several notations that didn't make sense. "Who's been managing this inventory?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Colonel Hartfield has been overseeing it personally," Tom said quietly. "But between you and me, Captain, I think someone's been skimming supplies, selling them off base maybe. There's no way we're using the amount of food that's being requisitioned." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. It wasn't enough that the prisoners were being mistreated. Someone was profiting from it. The rage she felt was hot and immediate, but she forced herself to breathe through it. "All right," she said. "I need you to do something for me, Tom. I need you to keep detailed records of everything going forward. Every ounce of food that comes into this kitchen, every ounce that goes out. I need witnesses. I need documentation." "That's a tall order, Captain," Tom said, glancing around nervously. "Colonel Hartfield won't like it." "I'm not asking if he'll like it," Margaret said. "I'm telling you that this needs to happen. You're in my chain of command when it comes to prisoner welfare. These are your orders, Sergeant." Tom nodded slowly, and Margaret could see the doubt in his eyes. But he also saw something else. Hope. Hope that maybe, finally, someone in a position of authority was going to do something about the injustice they both knew was happening. That night, Margaret sat in her small quarters, a sparse room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a single window that overlooked the barracks, and thought about why she had really joined the military. It wasn't just about finding purpose after her husband's death. It was about believing that the world could be better, that people could be better, that if you worked hard enough, if you tried hard enough, you could actually make a difference. She knew that Colonel Hartfield saw her as a joke, a widow playing soldier, as he had so unkindly put it. She knew that the other officers doubted her capabilities, her judgment, her right to be in command. And she knew that what she was about to do, investigating the food theft and prisoner mistreatment, would make her enemies. But she also knew that she couldn't look away. She had spent too many years looking away from injustice, telling herself that it wasn't her responsibility, that she didn't have the power to change anything. And it had made her miserable. It had made her feel small and powerless and complicit. Not anymore. Margaret pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. She was documenting everything she had found, everything that Tom had told her, everything that she had observed. She was creating a record that would be difficult to dismiss or explain away. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was going to be the beginning of something much larger than she had anticipated. As she wrote, she thought about the prisoners in the barracks beyond the fence. She had never actually seen them up close. She knew there were several hundred of them, soldiers who had been captured or had surrendered. She wondered what they thought about all of this. She wondered if they were afraid. She wondered if they understood that there were people on this base, people like her and Tom, who believed they deserved to be treated with dignity. The night was warm and humid, the Kentucky summer pressing down like a heavy blanket. Margaret worked long into the evening, documenting every inconsistency, every gap in the records, every piece of evidence that something deeply wrong was happening at Camp Meridian. And with each word she wrote, she felt something hardening inside her. Not bitterness exactly, but a kind of steel resolve. She was going to get to the truth, no matter how many people underestimated her, no matter how many times she was dismissed or mocked or sidelined. She was going to get to the truth, and she was going to make sure that justice was served. Because that was what soldiers were supposed to do. That was what it meant to serve your country. And Margaret Thornton had not worked this hard, sacrificed this much, to compromise on that principle now. 2 weeks into her investigation, Margaret had accumulated enough evidence to fill an entire folder. Tom had been meticulous in his record-keeping, and she had quietly interviewed several of the kitchen staff, all of whom confirmed her suspicions. The food that was supposed to be going to the prisoner barracks was simply disappearing. And while she didn't have definitive proof that Colonel Hartfield was directly involved in selling the supplies, the evidence certainly pointed in that direction. But Margaret knew better than to act on suspicion alone. She needed something concrete. She needed a smoking gun. It was Tom who brought her the breakthrough. He came to her office on a Thursday afternoon, moving carefully to ensure no one saw him, and placed a small piece of paper on her desk. "Found this in the trash behind the kitchen," he said quietly. It's a receipt from a business in town, Lucky's Supply Depot. Looks like someone's been selling supplies to them wholesale. Margaret picked up the paper with a sense of dread. It was only a partial receipt, but it was enough. The quantities matched exactly with what was missing from the camp's inventory. The date was from just 3 days ago, and though the name of the seller wasn't on the receipt, the handwriting was distinctive, a bold, slashing script that Margaret had seen before on various orders and memos around the base. She recognized that handwriting. It belonged to Colonel Hartfield's aide, Lieutenant Powell, a young officer who had come to the base about 6 months ago. "This is good work, Tom," Margaret said, though her mind was already racing ahead. "But this isn't enough. Lieutenant Powell could claim he was acting independently. We need to connect this to Colonel Hartfield directly." "Captain, I've done what I can," Tom said, and there was a note of worry in his voice. "Going any further than this is dangerous. You understand that, don't you? If this gets out, if people start asking questions. Colonel Hartfield has friends in high places. The last thing we need is to get on the wrong side of the wrong people." Margaret understood exactly what Tom was saying. She understood the risk. But she had already committed herself to this path, and backing down now would be worse than not starting at all. "Give me 2 more weeks," she said. "I'm going to need you to help me with one more thing. I need access to Colonel Hartfield's personal files." Tom's face went pale. "Captain, that's going too far. That's abuse of authority." "No," Margaret said calmly. "It's investigation, proper investigation. Tom, someone is stealing from the military. Someone is profiting from the suffering of prisoners in our care. Do you really want to walk away knowing you could have helped stop it?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Margaret could see the conflict written all over his face. He was a good man, she knew that. But he was also a man who had seen what happened to people who made enemies of the wrong people in the military. He had seen careers ruined and reputations destroyed. He was afraid, and that fear was paralyzing him. "Think about it," Margaret said gently, "and let me know what you decide." Over the next week, Margaret found herself drawn to the prisoner barracks in a way that surprised her. She had never really thought of the Japanese soldiers as individuals before. In her mind, they had been abstractions. The enemy, the ones who had killed American boys, the ones she was supposed to regard with distance and suspicion. But one afternoon, as she was reviewing food preparation in the kitchen, she made a decision that would change everything. She decided she wanted to see them, not from a distance, not through reports and statistics, but in person. She waited until late afternoon when most of the officers were in meetings or off duty. She put on her uniform, checked her appearance in the mirror, and then walked toward the prisoner barracks. The guards at the fence barely acknowledged her. She was an officer, and officers went where they wanted on the base. The barracks were simple, austere structures arranged in neat rows. The prisoners would be in their quarters now, waiting for the evening meal. As Margaret walked slowly between the buildings, she caught glimpses of men through the windows, some sitting on bunks, some standing at attention, some simply staring at nothing. They were younger than she expected. Most of them looked to be in their late teens or early 20s, far from home, probably terrified, certainly malnourished. She could see their ribs through their thin prison uniforms. She could see the hollowness in their eyes. One of them, a young man with sharp features and dark, intelligent eyes, was watching her intently. He was standing at the window of his barracks, and when he saw her looking at him, he didn't look away. Instead, he held her gaze with a directness that surprised her. Without allowing herself to think about it too much, Margaret changed course and walked toward that barracks. The guard at the door started to say something, but Margaret was already pulling rank. "Stand down, soldier," she said. "I need to speak with one of the prisoners. I'll only be a moment." Inside the barracks, it was sweltering. The heat seemed to radiate from the metal roof, and the smell was overwhelming, sweat and body odor and despair all mixed together. The young man she had been watching had moved away from the window and was now standing at attention with the other prisoners, his expression carefully neutral. "You," Margaret said, pointing at him, "step forward." The young man did as instructed, moving with the disciplined precision of a trained soldier. Up close, Margaret could see that he was even younger than she had thought, probably no more than 20. Despite his hunger, there was something dignified about the way he held himself, something that suggested he had not been broken by captivity. "Do you speak English?" Margaret asked. "Yes," the young man replied, his accent faint but noticeable. "I speak English," My name is Takeshi Nakamura. I was officer in Imperial Navy. I am proud to meet you, Captain. His politeness was almost absurd given his circumstances, and it struck Margaret with unexpected force. Here was a man who had been their enemy, who by all accounts should have been treated with coldness or even cruelty, and he was greeting her with genuine courtesy. "How long have you been at Camp Meridian?" Margaret asked. 3 months, Takeshi said. "I was captured in Pacific, brought here after Japanese defeat." Margaret hesitated, and then she asked a question that she knew was dangerous. "Are you getting enough to eat, Ensign Nakamura?" Takeshi's eyes flickered with something: surprise, caution, hope. He chose his words carefully. "We receive rations," he said. "It is not much, but we are soldiers. We understand sacrifice. We understand that we lost war and must accept consequences." There was no bitterness in his voice, no self-pity, just a kind of stoic acceptance that made Margaret's heart ache. She thought about how the American soldiers would behave in the same circumstances. She thought about how different this young man's response was from what she would have expected. "What if I could ensure that you received proper rations?" Margaret asked quietly. "What if I could make sure that the food you're supposed to get is actually getting here?" Takeishi looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. "Captain, I understand what you are trying to do. You are kind, woman, but this is not possible. You cannot change what is happening here. It is too big for one person. You will only hurt yourself." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but I'm going to try anyway." She turned and walked out of the barracks, her heart pounding. Behind her, she heard Takeishi call out softly, "Thank you, Captain, for caring." Those words haunted her for the rest of the day. She thought about them as she lay in her bed that night. She thought about the young man's quiet dignity, his acceptance of his fate, his genuine gratitude for something as simple as her asking about his food. And she thought about Colonel Hartfield, about the casual way he dismissed these men's suffering, about his willingness to profit from their hunger. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She was going to move forward with her investigation, and she was going to do it alone if necessary. She couldn't wait for Tom to build up his courage. She couldn't wait for permission or approval from people who didn't care about justice. The time for waiting was over. She spent the entire day documenting everything. She created a detailed timeline of the missing food shipments. She made notes about the receipt from Lucky's supply depot. She wrote down conversations she had overheard about selling supplies off base. And she composed a formal report detailing her findings and requesting an immediate investigation. That evening, she made a copy of her report and sealed it in an envelope. She had decided that she would hand it to Tom to keep safe, just in case. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew that Colonel Hartfield would not take kindly to being exposed. As she sat at her desk, reviewing her work one final time, Margaret thought about what Takeishi had said about her hurting herself. She knew he was right. She knew that this could destroy her career. It could ruin her reputation. It could blacklist her from ever serving in the military again. But she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she did nothing. And she realized with sudden clarity that this had never really been about the prisoners or the food or even Colonel Hartfield. This had been about proving to herself that she was more than what people thought she was, that she was more than someone to mock or dismiss, that her uniform meant something, that her choice to serve meant something. And she was going to prove that, no matter what it cost her. While Margaret continued her investigation, something unexpected happened at Camp Meridian that would ultimately change the trajectory of everything that was to come. A directive arrived from the Pentagon in Washington, signed by none other than the Deputy Secretary of Defense. It was a new initiative called the Good Faith Program, and its purpose was to demonstrate American values and generosity to the prisoners of war. The program was designed to help prisoners understand what America stood for, not just military power, but abundance, generosity, and democratic values. It was a psychological operation of sorts, a way to show the enemy that in victory, Americans were magnanimous and civilized. And it included something quite revolutionary. A special meal would be prepared for all prisoners, a meal that showcased American food and American abundance. The directive specifically stated that the meal should include items that would be shocking and impressive to the Japanese soldiers, things they would not have access to in their home country. And it mandated that officers like Margaret oversee the preparation and distribution personally. When Margaret received the order, she felt a surge of almost manic hope. This was her opportunity. This was her chance to do things the right way, to serve proper food, to show these men what they should have been receiving all along. And more importantly, it was an opportunity to document Colonel Hartfield's response. If he tried to interfere with the program, if he tried to steal or divert the special meal, she would catch him in the act with witnesses present. The special meal was scheduled for a Saturday evening 2 weeks away. Margaret immediately threw herself into the planning. She worked with the kitchen staff to determine the menu. She requested the finest ingredients available, including items that had been specially allocated for the program. Thick steaks, fresh vegetables, dairy products, and something that Margaret thought would truly shock the prisoners: French fried potatoes, something the Japanese soldiers would never have encountered. Tom became her partner in this endeavor, and his enthusiasm gave Margaret hope that he was finally ready to help her see this through. Together, they began to plan for what they knew would be the critical test. But as the date of the special meal approached, Margaret began to notice that something was wrong. Colonel Hartfield seemed oddly uninterested in the program. He didn't interfere, didn't complain, didn't even seem to be paying attention. That worried Margaret more than if he had fought against it. It suggested that he knew something she didn't. It suggested that he had a plan. 3 days before the special meal, Margaret was going over the food requisitions when Tom hurried into her office with an expression of barely concealed urgency. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Hartfield just submitted a request to have half the special meal allocated diverted to a donor event in town. He says there's a wealthy businessman who's contributing to the war effort and needs to be impressed with American hospitality." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Did he actually say that? "It's in writing," Tom said, pulling out a memo. "Signed by him and everything. Captain, he's going to steal half the food meant for the prisoners and use it to wine and dine some civilian. And because it's technically in a memo, he's making it look official." This was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. This was when she would finally have undeniable proof. But she also realized that if she moved too quickly, if she exposed him before the meal actually happened, he would find a way to wriggle out of it. He would claim it was a miscommunication. He would blame Tom. He would make it her fault somehow. So she made a difficult decision. She was going to let him steal the food. She was going to document every step of it. And then, when the prisoners were watching, when the meal was supposed to be served, she was going to expose him for what he was. It was risky, it was ambitious. It was the kind of move that could backfire spectacularly. But Margaret had spent her entire life playing it safe, and it had gotten her nowhere except isolated and frustrated. It was time to take a real risk. She called Colonel Hartfield and requested a meeting. When she arrived at his office, he was sitting behind his desk with an expression of smug satisfaction. "Captain Thornton," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "I hear you've been very busy with this special meal program." "Yes, sir," Margaret said carefully. "The prisoners will be receiving their first genuine experience of American food and American abundance. It's a significant opportunity to demonstrate our values." "Indeed," Colonel Hartfield said, leaning back in his chair. "Which is why I've decided to take a more personal role in ensuring that the meal reflects the very best of what America has to offer. I've arranged for some of the food to be served at a special reception for the town's donors and dignitaries. They'll be able to taste what the prisoners will be eating and understand the magnitude of American generosity." "Sir, with respect," Margaret said carefully, "the directive was clear that the entire meal was to be provided to the prisoners, not to be shared or distributed elsewhere." Colonel Hartfield's expression hardened. "Are you questioning my judgment, Captain?" "No, sir," Margaret said smoothly. "I'm simply nodding what the directive states. I would hate for there to be any confusion later about how we interpreted our orders." She could see Colonel Hartfield calculating, trying to determine if she was a threat or simply naive. After a moment, he smiled thinly. "Your concern is noted, Captain, but I assure you this is the right approach. We'll serve the prisoners their meal, and we'll also demonstrate American abundance to our civilian supporters. It's a win for everyone." Margaret stood to leave, and as she did, she noticed that Colonel Hartfield had left the memo about the diverted food sitting on his desk. She had seen enough to know the details. She excused herself and returned to her office, where Tom was waiting anxiously. "He's going to do it," she told him. "He's going to steal the food and serve it at a donor event tomorrow night." "So what do we do?" Tom asked. Margaret smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "We let him, and then we catch him." The day of the special meal arrived with clear skies and the kind of heat that made Kentucky summers almost unbearable. Margaret had been up since dawn, coordinating with the kitchen staff to prepare the food. There were steaks that had been specially ordered, brought in from a premium supplier. There were vegetables, fresh corn, potatoes ready to be fried. There was butter and milk and cream. There was everything that a prisoner who had been eating basic rations for months would dream about. By late afternoon, Margaret noticed that several of the food crates were being quietly moved by soldiers under Colonel Hartfield's direct supervision. The crates that were supposed to contain the steaks and the finest portions were being diverted to the back of a truck that was parked near the fence. Margaret was ready. She had arranged for several witnesses to be positioned strategically around the kitchen area. She had documented the numbers and the items. She had also done something else that was either very clever or very foolish. She had alerted General Morrison's office to watch for any irregularities regarding the special meal program. By 6 o'clock that evening, as the sun began to lower on the horizon, the prisoners were assembled in the dining hall. Margaret stood at the front of the room, her uniform immaculate, her expression calm and commanding. Tom stood beside her, and they both knew that what was about to happen would change everything. Takeshi Nakamura was among the prisoners, and when his eyes met Margaret's, she saw recognition and, oddly, a kind of resignation. He knew something was about to happen. He could sense it the way a soldier can sense tension and danger. Then Colonel Hartfield arrived, and immediately began giving orders that contradicted Margaret's careful planning. "Serve the prisoners the standard rations," he announced loudly. "The special meal has been reassigned." It was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir," she said clearly. "I have documentation that the special meal was diverted against explicit orders from the Pentagon. Additionally, I have witnesses and physical evidence of food theft from camp supplies, dating back several months." The room went silent. Every eye turned to Margaret and Colonel Hartfield. Colonel Hartfield's face turned purple with rage. "You're out of line, Captain. You have no authority to—" "Actually, sir," a new voice interrupted, "she does." Everyone turned to see a tall officer in dress uniform who had just entered through the back of the dining hall. It was Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, a regional commander who reported directly to the Pentagon. Behind him were two military police officers. Margaret had no idea how Whitmore had arrived, but she felt a surge of gratitude. General Morrison must have moved faster than she expected. "I received a report this morning regarding irregularities at Camp Meridian," Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore said, his voice cold and official. "Colonel Hartfield, I'm going to need you to come with me. We have a lot to discuss." As the military police escorted Colonel Hartfield out of the dining hall, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked around at the prisoners, at their confused expressions and their hungry eyes, and she made a decision. "Serve the special meal," she ordered the kitchen staff. "Serve everything now." What happened next was something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. The kitchen staff moved with purpose, bringing out the prepared food. As the prisoners received their trays, their reactions ranged from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like tears. Takeshi Nakamura stared down at his plate. A thick steak, golden fried potatoes, fresh corn on the cob, with an expression of profound shock. "This is real?" he asked, looking at Margaret. "It's real," Margaret confirmed. "It's American food, it's American abundance, it's what you should have been receiving all along." As she watched the prisoners eat, some of them slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear if they ate too quickly, Margaret realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward. This wasn't about revenge or even justice exactly. It was about bearing witness. It was about someone seeing the truth and refusing to look away. It was about one person deciding that things could be different and having the courage to make them so. The investigation into Colonel Hartfield's activities moved with surprising swiftness. By the end of the following week, military prosecutors had amassed enough evidence to bring charges of embezzlement, theft, and misappropriation of military resources. The special receipt Tom had found was only the beginning. Once investigators started looking carefully, they discovered a pattern of systematic stealing that went back nearly 2 years. Colonel Hartfield had been selling military supplies to civilian contractors and pocketing the profits. The total amount involved was staggering, nearly $80,000, an enormous sum in 1945. But what struck Margaret most was how few people seemed genuinely shocked by the discovery. The military culture of that era was rife with small corruptions and unauthorized dealings. Men like Colonel Hartfield did whatever they wanted because no one with the power to stop them had chosen to do so. The system was designed to protect its own. The only reason Colonel Hartfield was facing consequences now was because Margaret had been stubborn enough, brave enough, and possibly foolish enough to refuse to accept the way things were. The fallout at Camp Meridian was immediate and chaotic. Colonel Hartfield was removed from his position within days. He was eventually court-martialed, found guilty, and dishonorably discharged. But perhaps more significantly, Camp Meridian came under new leadership, and the new commanding officer, Colonel Robert Ashton, was a man of genuine principle. He immediately instituted reforms that Margaret had been pushing for all along: proper prisoner welfare standards, regular inspections, and an end to the casual cruelty that had characterized the previous regime. And yet, despite the victory, Margaret found herself in an unexpected position. She was now regarded with suspicion by many of the officers on base who had benefited from or looked the other way regarding Colonel Hartfield's activities. She was called a troublemaker, a rule follower, a woman who didn't understand how the military really worked. She received anonymous notes suggesting she transfer. Certain officers stopped greeting her when they passed in the hallway. She found herself increasingly isolated, even as the prisoners and the enlisted men began to treat her with open respect. Tom had been protected to some extent by his involvement in the investigation, but even he had become a social pariah among the officer class. They ate lunch together in the dining hall, two of them against the world, never speaking about it directly but both acutely aware that they had crossed a line that many people believed should never have been crossed. It was during this difficult period that Takeshi Nakamura requested a private meeting with Margaret. She was initially uncertain about how to handle it. Fraternizing with prisoners was technically against regulations. But Colonel Ashton gave his permission, understanding that there was something more complicated and important happening here than simple protocol. They met in Margaret's office on a warm afternoon in early August. Takeshi had been assigned to work in the camp kitchen under the new administration, a job he was excellent at, and that gave him some small privileges and freedoms compared to his life in the barracks. "Captain Thornton," he said, standing respectfully at attention, "I want to thank you for what you did, for the meal, but also for changing things here, for treating us with dignity when you did not have to." Margaret studied the young man carefully. In the weeks since the special meal, he had seemed to gain some weight back, and there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The hunger and despair had diminished, though it would never completely disappear. "I did what was right," Margaret said simply. "And I did it for myself as much as for you, maybe more for myself if I'm being honest." "No," Takeshi said, shaking his head. "You did it because you are a good person, because you understand that dignity is not something that can be taken just because someone loses a war." They talked for nearly an hour, and Takeshi told her about his life before the war, about his family in Kyoto, about the officer training program he had attended, about his dreams of becoming a teacher after the war ended. Margaret told him about her husband, about losing him and finding the military, about struggling to be taken seriously in a world that wanted to keep her small and quiet. By the time Takeshi left her office that afternoon, something had shifted between them. They were not quite friends. The circumstances of their relationship made such a description complicated, but they were something more than officer and prisoner. They were two people who had borne witness to each other's humanity. It was also during this period that Margaret began documenting her experiences. She started writing down everything that had happened, everything she had discovered, everything she had learned. She wasn't quite sure why she was doing it. Perhaps she knew even then that the story needed to be recorded. Perhaps she understood that history had a way of erasing the contributions of women, especially women who had challenged the system. But her documentation came to an abrupt halt when she received her transfer orders in early September. She was being reassigned to a different base, a promotion actually. She would be a major now, commanding officer of the Prisoner Welfare Division at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. On the surface, it was a dream assignment, the kind of advancement she had worked for her entire career. She understood it for what it really was, though. It was exile. Gentle exile, perhaps, but exile nonetheless. The military establishment had decided that Margaret Thornton was too much trouble, too willing to challenge authority, too invested in reforming the system. They were removing her from Camp Meridian before she could cause any more disruption. Margaret received the news with a mixture of emotions that she could barely untangle. She was proud of what she had accomplished here. She was hurt by the realization that doing the right thing had made her unwelcome. But she was also, if she was honest with herself, relieved. The constant tension, the suspicion, the isolation, it was exhausting. And Fort Jackson represented a fresh start, an opportunity to build something better from the beginning rather than trying to reform something that was already broken. On her last day at Camp Meridian, Margaret walked around the base one final time. She visited the dining hall, the kitchen, the prisoner barracks. The men stood at attention when they saw her, and she received salutes and nods of respect. She understood now that their respect meant more to her than the approval of her fellow officers ever could have. She also visited Tom in his office to say goodbye. He walked her out to the gates of the base, and they stood together for a moment without speaking. "You did good work here," Tom finally said. "You should be proud." "So did you," Margaret replied. "Thank you for having the courage to help me. I know it cost you." "Worth it," Tom said simply. "To know that things are going to be different here, to know that future prisoners will be treated better because of what we did." As Margaret drove away from Camp Meridian in her personal automobile, watching the base recede in her mirror, she felt a sense of closure that surprised her. She had come here expecting to stay for years, expecting to gradually implement reforms and build a legacy. Instead, she had done the work in a matter of weeks, achieved her goals, and been pushed out by a system that was uncomfortable with change. She thought about Takeshi and wondered what would happen to him when the war eventually ended, when repatriation began and he was sent back to Japan. She wondered if he would remember her, if he would think about Camp Meridian as a place where, for a brief moment, an American officer had chosen his humanity over convenience. She drove through the Kentucky countryside, the summer heat gradually giving way to the first hints of autumn, and she realized something important. The victory at Camp Meridian wasn't complete. In many ways, the real work was just beginning. There were other bases, other camps, other instances of injustice that needed to be addressed. And now, with her promotion and her new position, she had the authority and the platform to address them. What had felt like an exile, she now understood, was actually an acceleration. She was being moved to a position where she could do even more good. And though she was leaving Camp Meridian behind, the lessons she had learned there, about courage, about persistence, about the power of one person to make a difference, those lessons would stay with her forever. Margaret's first 6 months at Fort Jackson were challenging in ways she had not anticipated. The Prisoner Welfare Division was even more neglected than it had been at Camp Meridian, and the systemic problems were far more entrenched. But she had learned valuable lessons from her previous experience, and she moved carefully, building relationships, documenting problems, and establishing herself as someone to be taken seriously. By the time 1946 arrived and the war in both the Pacific and Europe had ended, Margaret had implemented substantial reforms at Fort Jackson. The prisoners, many of whom were now being held in a kind of legal limbo, uncertain when or if they would be repatriated, were receiving better treatment, better food, and better conditions. She had also trained a new generation of officers on proper prisoner welfare protocols, people who understood that treating prisoners humanely was not weakness, but basic moral principle. But in early 1946, she received an unexpected package in the mail. It was a letter, handwritten on thin paper in careful English, postmarked from Japan. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was from Takeshi Nakamura. Somehow, after the war ended and prisoners were being repatriated, he had managed to track down her address. The letter told her that he had returned to his home in Kyoto, where he had found that his family had survived the war, though his home had been damaged in the firebombing. He was planning to start a school for children, and he wanted Margaret to know that it was because of her example that he had the courage to pursue his dream of teaching. But there was something else in the package. Takeshi had included a second document, a manifesto of sorts, written in both Japanese and English. It was an account of his experience as a prisoner of war, documenting the conditions under Colonel Hartfield, but also the moment when things changed when Margaret stood up and served the special meal. More significantly, he had shared the document with teachers and educational administrators in Japan, and it had become something of a symbol of dignity and compassion in a post-war world. Margaret held the letter and the document in her hands and felt the weight of history, understanding for the first time the true impact of what she had done. She hadn't just changed things at Camp Meridian. She had influenced someone in a position to shape the future, to influence how an entire generation of Japanese children would view America and Americans. She wrote back to Takeshi, and they began a correspondence that would continue for many years. He would tell her about starting his school, about how it grew and prospered, about the generations of children he taught. She would tell him about her continued work in prisoner welfare, her gradual advancement through the military ranks, her slow realization that what had started as standing up against corruption at one base had become a lifelong commitment to reform and human rights. But the unraveling secret came not from Takeshi or from anything overseas. It came from something much closer to home. In early 1947, Margaret received a visit from a journalist named Sarah Chen. Sarah was a Chinese-American woman working for a national magazine, and she had been researching the story of Camp Meridian. She had learned about Colonel Hartfield's arrest, about the court-martial, about the prisoner welfare reforms, and she had somehow managed to track down Margaret and was now sitting across from her in a coffee shop near Fort Jackson, asking her to tell her story. "I don't usually give interviews," Margaret said carefully. "I'm not comfortable drawing attention to myself." "I'm not asking for attention," Sarah said. She was probably about Margaret's age, maybe slightly younger, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a way of speaking that suggested she was used to people listening to her. "I'm asking for truth. The story of what happened at Camp Meridian has become a kind of local legend in Kentucky, but the details are muddled and the key figure, you, has disappeared into silence. I think people deserve to know what really happened." Margaret was quiet for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened in the nearly 2 years since she had left Camp Meridian. She thought about the isolation she had endured, the way the military establishment had pushed her out. She thought about how easy it would be to simply let the story disappear, to let her contributions be forgotten. But she also thought about all the young officers she had trained, all the prisoners who had been treated better because of the reforms she had implemented, all the future prisoners who would benefit from the system she had helped establish. And she thought about Takeshi and his school, about the way individual acts of courage could ripple outward in ways that changed the course of history. "All right," she said finally. "I'll tell you everything, but I want it on record that I didn't do this for personal glory. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Over the course of the next 3 months, Sarah Chen conducted a series of interviews with Margaret, Tom, other officers at Fort Jackson, and people back in Kentucky who had been connected to Camp Meridian. She also secured interviews with several Japanese prisoners who had since returned to Japan. The resulting article was published in a national magazine in the summer of 1947, and it caused quite a sensation. The headline read, "One Woman's Stand: How Captain Margaret Thornton Exposed Corruption and Changed American Military Prisoner Policy." The article detailed everything: the food theft, the special meal, the investigation, the court-martial. But more importantly, it portrayed Margaret not as a heroic figure, but as an ordinary woman who had been willing to do the extraordinary thing of standing up for what was right. The article also, for the first time, gave proper attention to Colonel Hartfield's ultimate fate. He had spent 2 years in military prison before being released, and he had died in 1946 under somewhat mysterious circumstances, officially a heart attack, though some people whispered about other possibilities. His reputation had been entirely destroyed. His family had suffered social ostracism, and his name had become synonymous with corruption and greed. When the article was published, Margaret braced herself for the fallout. She expected anger from the military establishment, accusations that she had violated military code by speaking to a journalist, possibly even charges of insubordination or unauthorized disclosure of military information. What she actually received was something far more surprising. She received a commendation from the Pentagon. The article had captured the public imagination, and public opinion, it turned out, was strongly in favor of the woman who had stood up against corruption and for human rights. The military, sensing an opportunity for positive publicity and genuine reform, decided to embrace Margaret's story rather than suppress it. She was promoted to colonel at a special ceremony attended by high-ranking military officials and even a representative from the Pentagon. She was asked to speak at military academies about ethical leadership and the importance of standing up against wrongdoing. She received letters from across the country, from military personnel, from civilians, from former prisoners of war. The isolation that had followed her actions at Camp Meridian began to dissolve, replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. But Margaret understood, with the clear-eyed clarity that had served her so well, that this was not quite justice. It was not quite redemption. It was simply the recognition that she had been right, and that sometimes, when enough people understand that you were right, they can overcome their resistance to accepting that they were wrong. What mattered to her was not the commendation or the promotion, though she was grateful for both. What mattered was knowing that Takeshi was teaching children in Japan with the confidence that came from having been treated with dignity during a time of captivity and despair. What mattered was knowing that future prisoners would benefit from the reforms she had fought for. What mattered was knowing that she had looked injustice in the eye and had refused to blink. It was 1952, 7 years after the events at Camp Meridian, when Margaret received a final package from Japan. She was now a full colonel, and she was working in an advisory capacity to the Department of Defense on international prisoner treatment standards. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life defined by service and purpose. The package was from Takeshi, now headmaster of a thriving school in Kyoto. Inside was a photograph and a letter. The photograph showed Takeshi standing with a group of American military officials in front of a school building. But that wasn't what made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It was the banner hanging above the school entrance. It was written in both English and Japanese, and it read, "Margaret Thornton School for Ethical Leadership." The letter explained that Takeshi, deeply grateful for what Margaret had done, had wanted to honor her memory. But it turned out she wasn't dead. It was called the Margaret Thornton School because the school was dedicated to teaching the principles that Margaret embodied. Courage, integrity, the willingness to stand up against wrongdoing even when it cost you personally. Margaret wept when she read this. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release, of finally understanding the full scope of what her actions had meant. She had not simply changed a policy or exposed a corrupt officer. She had inspired someone from a defeated enemy nation to build something better, to dedicate himself to teaching generations of young people the importance of ethical behavior and respect for human dignity. The twist, however, came several weeks later. A researcher from a Tokyo university contacted Margaret to inform her of something extraordinary. Takeshi, in writing the curriculum for his school, had drawn heavily on interviews and accounts from American military officers who had treated prisoners well. In addition to Takeshi's own experiences, the curriculum included accounts from other Japanese prisoners who had been at various camps throughout America. One of those accounts came from a man named Kenji Yamamoto, who had been imprisoned at Camp Meridian just before the war ended. Kenji had become a journalist in post-war Japan, and he had written extensively about his experiences in American captivity. His writings had circulated in Japanese intellectual circles and had influenced how Japan understood the American concept of human rights and dignity. But here was the twist that changed everything. Kenji had investigated the allegations against Colonel Hartfield and had discovered something shocking. Hartfield had not acted alone. He had had partners in the theft ring, officers at other bases, government contractors, even a few politicians. When Hartfield was court-martialed and exposed, he had agreed to testify against some of his co-conspirators in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony had led to the exposure of a vast corruption network that extended far beyond Camp Meridian. In the 7 years since the original investigation, that network had been slowly dismantled. High-ranking military officials had resigned or been quietly transferred. Contractors had lost their government contracts. Politicians had declined to run for re-election. It had been a slow, methodical process, but it had been thorough. And it had all started because Margaret had been willing to stand up and say no. The researcher sent Margaret copies of the articles Kenji had written, translated into English. Reading them, Margaret understood that her actions had had consequences that rippled far beyond what she had ever imagined. She had not just changed Camp Meridian. She had helped expose a system of corruption that had been bleeding the American military for years. And in doing so, she had helped prevent future injustices and future abuses. When Margaret was offered the chance to retire from the military in 1955, she accepted. She had served her country with honor, and she had done what she had set out to do. She was awarded the Medal of Service at her retirement ceremony with full military honors. But the real recognition came at a ceremony in Tokyo in 1956. Margaret was invited to the opening of a new wing at the Margaret Thornton School. She traveled to Japan for the first time in her life, a woman who had never left the American South until she entered the military, now boarding a transatlantic flight to witness the monument to her actions. At the ceremony, she was introduced to Kenji Yamamoto, the journalist who had helped uncover the broader corruption network. Kenji was perhaps 60 years old, with kind eyes and gray beginning to show in his hair. He told Margaret that his first memory of her was seeing her stride through the dining hall at Camp Meridian, her uniform perfect, her expression determined, carrying that tray of food as if she was carrying the future itself. "You changed my life," Kenji told her. "Not just with the meal, though that was important, but by showing me that one person could stand up against corruption and injustice and win, that one person could refuse to accept the way things were and make them better. I have spent my entire career trying to honor that lesson, trying to help my country understand what you taught me about courage." Margaret stood in the auditorium of the school that bore her name, surrounded by Japanese teachers and students, many of whom would never have the opportunity to speak to her but whose lives had been shaped by her choices. And she understood, finally, the full scope of what it meant to do the right thing. It wasn't about personal gain or recognition. It wasn't even about punishment for those who did wrong. It was about creating a model for how humans could behave toward each other, about showing that dignity and respect could be choices every single day. She looked out at the students, Japanese children, many of them descended from people who had been on the other side of the conflict, and she realized that the most profound victory wasn't political or military. It was human. It was the creation of a generation of young people who understood that treating people with respect was not an afterthought or a luxury. It was the foundation of a civilized society. In her later years, Margaret would write her memoirs, detailing her entire life and career, but giving particular attention to the events at Camp Meridian and the ripples they had caused. The book would be published after her death in 1978, and it would become required reading in military academies and schools of ethics across the country. But long before that, in 1956, standing in that auditorium in Kyoto, Margaret understood something essential. The fries that had shocked the enemy were not really about food. They were about the revolutionary idea that even your enemies deserve dignity. They were about the understanding that true strength lies not in domination, but in the choice to treat people well even when you have the power to do otherwise. She stood beside her at the end of the ceremony, and they embraced like two people who had shared a secret that changed the world. They never saw each other again after that day, but they continued to correspond until Takeshi's death in 1980. In her last letter to him, Margaret wrote, "What we did together, standing up for what was right, refusing to accept injustice, extending dignity to those who were vulnerable, that was the real war we fought, and I believe we won it. We didn't just change policies or expose corruption. We changed how a generation of young people thinks about what it means to be human. That is a victory that no one can take away from us." Margaret Thornton passed away in 1978, having spent the last decades of her life continuing her work on prisoner welfare and ethical military conduct, never seeking glory but quietly, persistently, standing up for what was right. She had come into the military as a widow seeking purpose, and she had left it as a woman who had found not just purpose but profound meaning in the simple act of refusing to look away from injustice. And on a warm afternoon in Kyoto, in a school that carried her name, generations of young people, both Japanese and American, both military and civilian, continued to learn the lessons that Margaret had taught through her actions. That one person can make a difference, that courage is not the absence of fear but the choice to act despite fear, and that in a world filled with hunger and injustice, sometimes the most revolutionary act is to share your abundance with those who have none. The fries, those simple golden potatoes, had shocked the Japanese prisoners because they represented something more than food. They represented a choice. They represented the decision of one woman to say that dignity could not be taken, that respect was not earned through victory or defeat, but was simply the baseline requirement for being human. And that choice, made on a warm evening in Kentucky in 1945, had echoed across oceans and decades, transforming not just one base or one group of prisoners, but the world itself.